concentrating on really some technical compliance-based approaches to board structure with a focus on the ASX principles. Now, a lot of companies aren't ASX listed, and as well as that, is it the most important aspect of structure? Well, that's particularly arguable. It is important if you're listed, but is it the most important is an arguable point. So what I'd like to do is give you kind of an approach here that you can use to thinking about the structure of the board. The first thing is you need to work out what the key role emphasis of your board actually is. I'd point you back to the last module's content around the changing nature or emphasis on a board's role. So you need to work out what your board needs to do. It's only once you've done that that you can move to the second step, which is who do we need? Okay, so what skills, experience, contacts, etc. do we need to execute that role set? Now, when you're in an ASX listed organisation, of course, what you're going to have traditionally is diversified shareholders, a separation of ownership from control. So in an ASX situation, what you have is an increasing emphasis on monitoring. You have an increasing emphasis also on compliance and signalling or symbolic behaviour, right? Because you want to give confidence to the market. Those two things push you to wanting independence in your structure. So hopefully you can see it's actually the role set that's driving the push for independence rather than independence in and of itself being a necessity on each and every board. Put it this way, step back and think about what do we actually need. That's the way to execute that role set that we need. And that's probably the broadest, simplest approach that you can get. You can think about a board, and what boards traditionally do is come up with a skill matrix. So they put the skill or experience here, and then they think about Director A, Director B, Director C, and then they might say we need some finance skills, we need some industry experience, and they need to be honest. Now, of course, you're going to come up with more than that, and I've used some very trite ones, but they're going to say, okay, well, Director A has finance skills, no industry, and they're honest, and B is just honest, and C has finance, and D might have finance as well. And what it clearly shows is, okay, we need to recruit someone to bring in these industry skills because we don't have it. So that's how a skills matrix actually gets used. Notice also, one of the things that occurs with a skill matrix is that you might want a mix of these skills. For instance, finance, you might want to have a couple of people with finance or a few people, but not everyone. And some of them, you might only want one or two people, maybe industry experience. That's probably a bad example. You want several, but maybe something like HR or marketing background, you might want one or two. And then some attributes like honesty, strategic thinker, etc., you might want everyone to have it. So it's actually a reasonably complex process because you also need to have the skills to be able to put people into the committees that are necessary. Okay, so this is one of the reasons that people use such a structured approach and things like matrices. One final thing while we're talking about these skills and attributes, I think a nice way to conceptualise the way to think about what a director brings to a board is to think about them kind of as a T. This is an old kind of OB approach to thinking about someone in a transdisciplinary team or an interdisciplinary team. And that's really what we're dealing with boards of directors. You're going to have a whole different series of skill sets and backgrounds coming together to think about the key problems and decisions at the most senior level facing an organisation. So when we do this kind of skills matrix, what we concentrate on is this kind of depth of the T. Okay, that's the really kind of thing that we're concentrating on, is the differences between people, the finance, the industry, etc. Okay. What we don't often think about is this top of the T, what everyone needs. So when we have discussions around diversity on a board, we're talking about this bottom of the T. But even when you have a diverse group, you actually do need to have things that are shared. Right? So think about a somewhat trite example. You could have 5 of the most brilliant people in the world in a group together working on a problem, but it's not going to get very far if they don't speak the same language. Okay, so they have to at least share the language to be able to exchange the ideas. Sure, they can do it with interpreters, but it becomes more difficult, it takes longer, etc. There's all these kind of problems. So what you've got to think about is, while we can have diversity, it's also what's the commonality that we need. And the key areas of commonality that people tend to think about in terms of board is some sense of values and direction of the company, some basic finance, and some basic governance knowledge. Like if you don't have those, it becomes quite difficult. So you think of all of the major groups in high stakes environments, airlines, military, medical, they're all trained to have a similar language, a similar approach to certain kinds of things. Yes, there are specific differences. If you're getting brain surgery, you tend to only have 1 or 2 people who are brain surgeons. You also have some critical care nurses and anaesthetists and orderly to clean things, but they do know how things should operate. They do know what certain words mean, etc., so that they can work together. So there is a lot of commonality as well as those differences that allow them to function. So when you're thinking about a structure of the board, that's something we need to think of as well. Often you can't recruit those. What you have to do is if you can't select on it, is you can try and address it at the induction and development stage of particular directors. So if I get one of the hard examples, you might have a not-for-profit board where someone is genuinely elected, so they end up on the board and they might have no finance skills. Well, the board will function a lot better if they can develop some basic finance skills, and so you might have some form of development program on your board to try and bring that up to speed. So you tend to select on that depth, but try and build that top of the T and take it into account when we're selecting directors. So the final thing about structure that I harked back to in the previous slide, I think, was we also have to have a structure that allows us to put in place committees. So committees tend to support boards, they help them in the decision-making function. We won't go into a lot of detail, there's some stuff in the text about committees if you're quite interested, but I do think it's an important element of structure because, for instance, most boards have an audit committee, and if the terms of reference of your audit committee say that a majority or even all of them need to be independent, well then you have to have enough independent directors on your board to be able to fulfil that requirement in your audit committee. So I'm just using that as a simple example of the interaction between your committees and the board. Okay. One of the other things about committees, 2 things to think about with committees. While boards don't tend to do this, you actually can delegate decision-making ability to a committee. It's the same authority that we had coming back from the last module's content on delegation, so you can delegate to a committee. Most boards don't though, because they want the whole board to be reminded that in these major decisions, the board's making the decision. So most committees just make recommendations to the board, which generally the board adopts, but you can delegate to them. The second thing is a committee, you can co-opt or you can get outsiders onto a committee. So in some rare instances, not rare, but in some instances where you might have the skills on the board, what you can do is set up a committee. So if you have a not-for-profit where you get a lot of directors elected who may not have accounting or finance skills, you might set up a finance committee and you might get some experts on that finance committee to spend particular time looking at that topic in detail. So that's an example of where you get this interplay between the skills of the board and the skills on the committee. Okay, that's probably enough about structure. If I was to summarise, I think what you need to be able to do is to look at your board, to look at your organisation, think about what does that board need to be able to do, and then take the next step down and say, well, who do we actually need to fulfil that? You'll also need to look at the regulation that applies to you, particularly if you're something like APRA regulated or ASX regulated. There'll be specific requirements, even expectations, as in the case of the ASX principles, that will go to your structure as a board. And they're all factors that make the composition of the board a quite complex process as you try and develop a group that can effectively execute that role set you require of them. So with that out of the way, the next thing we're going to look at is, okay, so we've got these people on the board, what's the relationships between them and how do they work together in terms of policy and process?
Stop it.